Welcome, Professor Jan de Vries. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today. Our first question for you is, how in your career did you start working with global history, and what defines it in your conception?
All right. Well, I guess I should begin by saying that I never thought of myself as a global historian. I've never aspired, you might say, to be a global historian. But there are certain research themes that I have been interested in all my career that are related to, or that perhaps lead one toward engagement with global historians. I'm an economic historian, and in my dissertation and my first work as a economic historian, I was particularly interested in regional and transnational histories and comparative histories. So you might say I was interested in everything except the nation state. I was interested in regions that are smaller than the state, or the larger macro regions that are larger than the state somehow, and but not the state itself. And quite a number of my works, I think, show that peculiarity. You might say, from a historical perspective, I was somewhat influenced by the Annales school, by Fernand Brauddel's Mediterranean world as a macro region. But I also was interested in agricultural history and the micro regions that are smaller than a state, or that might cross a boundary of one state to the other, and to follow the thread of my research interest across those boundaries if necessary. Second, so this in a way takes you toward global history, because it's not the globe that you're studying, something smaller, but it is an organized complexity that is not defined by the nation. A second form of work that I've been engaged in, particularly later in my career, that also leads in this direction, is the study of international and intercontinental trade. As an economic historian of the early modern period of European history, you might say this is just begins as a part of colonial history. But if you then study it, might say, across the boundaries of empire, then it becomes a kind of a globalizing, if not a global history. So some years ago, I wrote a study of European trade with Asia, a quantitative study. In a way, it was easy to do because there were many such studies based on the English East India Company, the Dutch East India Company, the Portuguese Casa de India, etc., etc. The only thing I did was to bring them all together. You might say it was a simple move, but suddenly you saw something at the international level in terms of European trade with all of Asia, rather than Dutch trade with Indonesia, or English trade with India, and that was not revealed by the national narratives and the national histories. So that's a second way in which I, in my own work, have been, I might say, moving in the direction of the global. But in a way, neither of these historical traditions of regional or transnational history, nor of the study of intercontinental trade, by themselves lead you or constitute global history. It's you might say the motivations are not quite the same as what I would call global history, which I addressed in an article I wrote called "Reflections on Doing Global History" in a book of several about 10 years ago. I'll stop at that with that. Now, the second part of your question: what is global history? Well, in the United States, I think in English-speaking countries, you sometimes hear two terms used. One is world history, and the other is global history. I think that's a way to get into, to lead us toward a definition. World history, certainly in the United States, has been with us now for quite a long time, a world history movement. And it has been a project of pedagogical reform. You might say it's focused on the teaching of history, particularly at the university level. The idea was to expand history's reach from a Eurocentric view of a kind of the tradition of studying Western civilizations, sort of from the Egyptians to the Greeks to the Romans to the French to the English and then to the Americans as the culmination of some kind of a long process of evolution of Western civilization. So the standard method for the world historian was to, I say, study through comparative history the various world civilizations, to approach this in a, might say, a non-judgmental way, to make comparisons and reflections, and to decenter the narrative of world history. Now, global history, which really came somewhat later, and from the beginning strove to achieve something different than what I've just described. It was more focused on a research agenda than a teaching agenda. It too, of course, rejected the Eurocentric premises of so much Western historical research, but it sought to write a kind of original accounts of the global character of historical events and processes that otherwise would not be readily observed. You might say it was looking for a kind of a hidden history, seeing something you wouldn't otherwise observe through contact and interactions that were below the surface, that were not part of the official history, or that were irregular in some way. And they also were interested in what you might call parallel developments, that is, histories in different parts of the world that occurred pretty much independently of each other. They were not simply reactions to events in some other part of the world, but that had a kind of that had a similarity. So that raises the question of, well, so what was there causing similar people in similar circumstances to deal with their problems in what seemed to be similar ways, even though they were not in contact with each other. Chris Bailey's work, The Birth of the Modern, is, I think, a pretty good example of that. Well, so that, I think, is what global history aspires to do. I think it's more of an aspirational history than a settled matter. That makes it hard to define.
Perfect, Professor. And our second question for you is, what are the possibilities, in your opinion, for dialogue between the local and the global, the micro and the macro?
Yeah. Well, that is a topic that I've been involved in recently. I have a paper in the recent issue of Past and Present. It's a supplement to their normal numbers. The supplement's called Global History and Microhistory. So I should have a few things to say about this. Microhistory, for a very long time, has been, I would say, hostile, certainly a reaction against histories that focus on structures, social scientific concepts, large-scale historical questions, master narratives. Well, you get the picture. So microhistory, you might say, is sort of instinctively, I think, not well disposed to the movement of global history, which confronts large-scale historical works and that often makes use of social scientific concepts to organize the large scale of the research question. But so there's a certain tension between micro and small scale histories and global history. But there is one very big thing that they have in common that makes microhistory and global history, you might say, two peas in a pod, two very similar types of enterprise. And that is the focus on the what I'll call the lateral interactions in a historical in a historical episode, rather than the narratives of change over time. In the case of microhistory, if you look at microhistory and global history, they differ in geographical scales and in social scales, but they share the same temporal scale often. They both confine themselves to a kind of short-term period, often a moment suspended in time, in order to focus on the synchronic relationships that are occurring in that moment. The historian Francesca Trivolata, who's written an influential piece on micro history, or the Italian microstoria, thinks that this is argues that this is a kind of essential feature of microhistory. It takes the synchronic approach by choice and by necessity, she says. Now, global history might not be tied to the synchronic approach out of some kind of inner necessity, but as a practical matter, that is, to actually do research in global history, the real existing global history has usually taken the form of these transnational, comparative, entangled histories. So you're looking at a short period of time in which then you are looking laterally across the globe, as it were, to see how the various societies or types of individuals have interacted with each other and influenced each other. So in this sense, I think that it's not so much that there is a potential for cooperation between global historians and microhistorians, but rather that they have methodologically, they have a great deal in common, which can be a source of strength, but also, I think, as I respond to some of your later questions, might show that it is also a limiting factor.
And talking about temporal scales, how to work with the multiple temporalities of global history, in your opinion? Is there a short-term global history?
Yeah, well, I think I just said that the problem with global history, or a problem with global history, is that it is it's most effective in addressing short-term questions, in dealing with something at a moment in time, or in a very short period of time, in which it can show and explore the lateral dimension of the globe, or some large organized complexity of the world in that period. If global history wants to deal with something longer term, and I think that's, to me as a historian, explaining change over time, the longer term is the most important thing. And so if global history were to address those most important questions, as I would call them, then what tools does it have available to it? Well, there's one but it is, you might say, the old-fashioned kind of history that many global historians have been trying to, as it were, to get beyond, and that is comparative history. The problem with comparative history is that there's always seems to be an asymmetry in the comparison. There is some standard model or some success story that is then being compared with some unsuccessful or less successful example. I can think back to the endless comparative histories I read as a student between the English and the French economies in the 18th and 19th centuries. And France was always being measured by an English yardstick. And well, there are many, many, many more examples of that kind of thing. Now, in the very influential work that's called the Great Divergence Literature, and one thinks of, in the first instance, of Ken Pomerantz's book of that title, but also by work by Bin Wang and by Jean-Laurent Rosenthal and quite a number of others by now. Their work tends to be based on a comparative history, but they very consciously attempt to, as it were, level the playing field, avoid the kind of Eurocentric standards of comparison. In fact, they use the term reciprocal comparison. That is, you compare England with China, but also China with England. That is, looking at England through the Chinese lens as well as looking through China through the English lens. In the example of Pomerantz's great book. Now, it's easier said than done, you might say. You can say, I'm not going to privilege one of the comparators. It's another thing to actually achieve it. But that is one way in which global history can have a larger scope, a larger scale. I realize that your question was about, can global history be short-term? My view is that, well, yeah, it's too much short-term. And the question is, can it be long-term? And just to conclude on this point, is there yet another way in which, another methodology for global history to achieve a longer term perspective? And well, all I can think of is the kind of synthetic interpretive histories that establish kind of meta-narratives. Should there be a meta-narrative for global history, or is the whole point of it to avoid that sort of thing? Well, I'll leave the answer to that question to others. The main problem here is that this is a kind of history that can only, I don't know if it can be only done, but usually is only done by, let's say, senior established scholars who are indulging in their hobby horses or their great insights and wisdom. It's not something that a graduate student can readily embark on, at least with any degree of safety. So it's perhaps a special taste for older historians.
Perfect. And maybe talking about young historians, but not only, does each type of research object have the potential to become a global history?
Well, each type of research object. So every kind of history, can it be global history, if I understand the question correctly? Well, as I said earlier, I think global history is best regarded as a kind of aspirational history. It lacks an agreed methodology to achieve its goals, or even a master narrative with which to arrange its provisional findings. You might say it's global history's future remains quite an unsettled question, and what the form it will take, the directions it will go in, I think are open to discussion. It's not easy to predict what it will look like, say, in 10 years' time. Now, for myself, as an economic historian, I think the means are at hand to write on a global scale. we have we can do that, you might say, based on the many existing studies and the research documentation that we have on world trade, colonial archives, the activities of international companies. There's a recent book by Dutch colleagues, Pim de Zwart and Jan Luiten van Zanden, called The Origins of Globalization, World Trade in the Making of the Global Economy, 1500, 1800. That is, I think, a good example of, is evidence that we already have the underlying studies that can allow for a very sound account of the developments of world trade, the interactions of the different parts of the world economically. I see more difficulties in other research themes. I don't know as much about them, so I could be that I'm missing quite a bit. But I see greater challenges. That is, there's not a path prepared for the globalization of every research theme. But for anyone who is contemplating, well, how can I study, say, world religion or world social history? I guess I would recommend, just as a kind of inspiration, the book of Jürgen Osterhammel, a German historian, who wrote a book that's in English called The Transformation of the World. He calls it A Global History of the 19th Century. I think the German title was Der Verwaltung der Welt, and it was published in English, I think, about 6-7 years ago. This is a massive study of every aspect of 19th century world history. That is a history, you might say, that was the European century, if there ever was one, and ever will be one. And yet, he tries to write, I think with a lot of success, a history of that century, not only in its political and familiar economic terms, but in social, cultural, religious terms, an integrated history of what was distinctive about the 19th century. So that's an example of someone who, in a perhaps idiosyncratic way, but in a way that I think could be an inspiration for many aspiring global historians to contemplate how they might turn their chosen topic into a more globalized kind of historical research.
And last but not least, our final question for you is, what are the main risks and challenges in global history, in your opinion, and if you want to share your criticisms about the field?
Well, what are the risks? I suppose that the greatest risk that I can think of is that it become highly ideological, becoming an advocate for a particular way of defining what the global is or what it should be. I say that because I think many people who are inspired by the notion, the concept of global history, come to with a kind from an idealistic impulse, that's very strong in the contemporary, at least Western world. That is that global history is something that needs to persuade humankind of its mutual interconnections. That is, the global historian has a mission. Now, I don't mean to say that's not a good mission, but mission-driven history can be, there are dangers in that, and that's so that those are the risks that I would I would identify. If it should be seen as a kind of special pleading for a particular approach to subjects, it would be, I think it would diminish the academic potential of global history. Dangers. Well, I suppose, speaking as a professional historian, that the challenges of global history are to find ways to research and write that are based on, that are professional, that are based on archival sources. That is, how can a graduate student writing a dissertation write global history? Is it only for established senior scholars? How do you train a global historian? Or do you have to train first a historian of some particular region of the world or country, some particular special subject, who then, as it were, grows into a global historian? So that, I think, has not really been worked out. I've been on committees of several students who have tried to, as it were, from the beginning, write something that was a global history. So I don't mean to say that it's impossible, but it is, I say, it still has professional risks. And so that's a challenge that, as a profession, I think historians wanting to advance the cause of global history still need to work out.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for taking our time to meet us and for all your very interesting answers. We hope that this hard phase ends soon, and then maybe one day you can come to Brazil to meet us.
Well, that would be